sponsored by the Institute on Disability and Human Development and the Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities program, both at UIC's Department on Disability and Human Development, as well as the Autism program of Illinois. Funding is provided in part by the Autism program of Illinois and the Illinois Department of Human Services. We are excited to have great presenters with us today to share about this important topic. Now, I will turn it over to the presenter.
Hi, everyone. This is Jessica Hinman. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think we are still waiting for Susan to get logged in, but while we wait for her, I'll go ahead and get us started and just give everybody a quick overview of our webinar and what we are planning to do for the remainder of our webinar series. So as some of you may have attended our webinar last week, this is a series focusing on exploitation and disability. Last week, we talked a little bit about human trafficking and disability and what it means for providers to be aware of some of those red flags and those warning signs. And this week, we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically sex trafficking and children with disability. More specifically, we will be talking about the tools and strategies to improve and to prevent and looking at the investigation and intervention pieces of human trafficking. So our speakers today are Susan Kahan. She is a visiting research specialist at the University of Illinois at Chicago and is part of the Institute of Disability and Human Services. The content developed was also developed in part by Jody Haskin, who is the executive director of the International Organization for Adolescence and a co-founder and steering committee member of the National Human Trafficking and Disability Working Group. And then I am Jessica Hinman. Again, I am a research coordinator at the UIC CBM Clinic. I'm also a doctoral candidate within the Rehabilitation Sciences program. So I will briefly turn it over to Jody to give a quick overview again about why we are doing this series and a little bit of a review of what we spoke about last week.
Great, thank you so much, Jessie. I am Jody Haskin from the International Organization for Adolescence. For those of you who joined us last week, I thank you for joining us again this week. For those of you who did not join us last week, we talked a lot about what human trafficking is and why it impacts young people who have disabilities. We really wanted to give you a good idea of what human trafficking is as a crime so you can understand what it is and what it isn't, and really be able to overcome some of the misconceptions that might be out there. We know that there are a lot of ways that people are really building on myths of what human trafficking is. And we want to make it very clear that human trafficking is a crime that can happen here in the United States. It can happen within people's homes. People are trafficked by people who are their family members. They're trafficked by people who care for them. Young people are trafficked. Older people are trafficked. Boys are trafficked. Anyone can be trafficked, but we know that there are some people who are more at risk of being trafficked. As a review, smuggling is not trafficking. I do want to talk about some of the questions that came up last week that we were unable to get to, and then we'll jump right into today's presentation. But I did want to clear up a couple of things for you all because I know that we had a really packed session last time. So first of all, smuggling is not the same as human trafficking. We may have heard many stories of people who may have have crossed a border, for example, and you may find them in the back of a semi, for example. This is an example of smuggling, which is a crime against a border. So this means that usually somebody has agreed to this act by itself, but human trafficking is something that people do not agree to. So in this case, if somebody is smuggled across the border, that's one thing, but it's not human trafficking. It can be very kind of tricky because we use that same kind of language for trafficking of drugs, trafficking of arms, but with trafficking of human, it just means that there is something of value that's being traded for either sex or labor. And for people over the age of 18 for sex trafficking, it's also with a form of force, fraud, or coercion. So there needs to be a means and there needs to be an ends, and there needs to be either force, fraud, or coercion if someone's over the age of 18 for sex trafficking. One of the questions that we had last week was if somebody who has a disability trades a sex act for accommodation, disability accommodation, is that considered sex trafficking? Well, it's considered sex trafficking if the person's under the age of 18. If the person's 18 or older, then there also has to be force, fraud, or coercion that's involved. Some of the other questions that came up last week were about prosecution, about what it looks like criminally, and we talked about some of the cases or last week we talked about some of the examples of cases of people who have been trafficked, who have disabilities. We talked about some very historical cases, and we talked about more recent cases. These are all very typical cases that we know have happened. But what we want to make sure that people understand is that when you're working with someone, you know who the person is. And when you start to see some changes, that's when you have to start thinking to yourself, are these going to be signs of human trafficking? Many people are aware of signs of abuse, but sometimes signs of human trafficking, labor trafficking, and sex trafficking aren't directly equal with signs of abuse as well. So these are some things that we will talk about today when we're looking at ways that young people are trafficked who may have disabilities. We know that there is a range of people who are participating today in the webinar. So we will try to be able to hit as many answers as we can about from different professions, from self-advocates and from family members and community members as they come in. And I just did want to start, if anyone has any questions that weren't able to get answered last week, if we could answer them now, you're welcome to put those in the chat box as well. Okay, well, we will go ahead and get started. I did want to introduce Susan Kahan, and she will be leading us through today's presentation. Susan?
All right, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Susan Kahan. Thank you. I so much appreciate everybody's attendance today. It's kind of for me, human trafficking it's an interesting place in the world of disability. Because it's a topic that we do think a lot sometimes, and I think more in the past several years, about issues around abuse and neglect and disability. Those have become more publicly acknowledged. As providers in the disability world, we're more aware of them. If you're from the trauma world, you're maybe starting to notice more when people who come to see you or need your assistance or you encounter have a disability. So there's just a greater awareness around that. Trafficking is something that we don't tend to think about, but as society as a whole, we tend to think less about it. We do tend to have pictures in our heads of what trafficking is, and it is the sort of that popular idea of, people trafficked across borders in the back of a pickup truck. When in fact, human trafficking happens in our communities, and it happens in all of our communities, and it happens often in relationship to people who are supposed to be taking care of us, and it happens when people's vulnerabilities are easily identified or quickly identified by somebody who's really good at identifying vulnerabilities and then takes advantage of those for their own personal gain. And so what I want to talk about today is, like, why is this why would we be talking to the members of the disability community, as well as the trauma community, as well as maybe victim service providers, even, I would hope law enforcement or other members of the justice system. Why do we need to think about this when we think about it in relationship to disability? What is the intersection, and why is that important to us? So let's get on that. Now I have to make sure I can advance these slides. All right. So one way that we think about any any new topic is, like, how pertinent is that to me? How big of a problem is this? And I was asked several years ago to do a presentation in New York at a conference on commercial sexual exploitation of children and disability, and sort of what does that intersection look like? And it was kind of a new topic for me. I had been involved in the context of some consulting that I do with the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center around cases involving children with disabilities who have been abused or exploited. And so I had some background in that, not a lot. And I didn't, and so I thought, most importantly, let me find statistics. How big is the problem? Because I always think that's important to talk about. And I did some basic research, and I really found nothing. There aren't statistics on issues related to the intersection of disability and trafficking. And so I thought, you know what, let me do my own quick research. I'm just going to call around in Chicago to the agencies that are involved in trafficking, and I'll ask them what their experience has been, and maybe get an idea in the Chicago area. What is the size of the problem? And so there are a lot of agencies involved in a lot of law enforcement agencies involved in in trafficking. And so I called the Chicago Police Department, Cook County Sheriff's Office, Homeland Security. The FBI in Chicago has a task force, or members of a task force on trafficking. And I called around to all of the different agencies and asked them their experience. And the answers that I got were, oh yeah, we've seen that. Yeah. And I said, oh, really? Yeah, I've seen that a couple times. And they're talking about people recovered from trafficking who have disabilities. I said, oh, a couple times this month, this year? And their answer would be, well, no, a couple times ever. I kept, and so then I'd explain to them some of the risk factors that we're going to go on to, some of the compounding vulnerabilities we're going to talk about, and why it's not possible that of all of their activity with regard to recovering people from trafficking, why it's not possible that such a tiny number of them were people with disabilities. The vulnerabilities are disproportionately represented in the disability community. So why? It doesn't make sense. But it was the universal response. The only person who had an interest even in thinking about this with me was the woman I spoke to from the FBI task force on trafficking. And she said, when we talked about sort of issues related to risk factors and vulnerabilities, she said, you're right. Like, it doesn't make sense. So where are the children? Where are they? Why aren't we counting them? And her theory was that they're all being identified basically under the heading of mental illness. That when a youth is recovered from trafficking, often there is a tremendous amount of mental health consequence to trafficking. Sometimes there are mental health issues that create vulnerabilities to trafficking, and they do tend to keep track of how many of the people they recover are dealing with issues related to mental illness. And she just figures, well, probably we're just sticking everybody under mental illness. She says the one place that she did recall seeing maybe more incidents of intellectual or developmental disability or autism among the population of people, youth recovered from trafficking, would be in pornography. But that it's true, like, where are where are the kids? Why aren't we counting them? Why aren't those numbers being captured in a way that helps us develop services more? That's why, right? That we need to know why, because we need to be able to develop services that are appropriate, that accommodate, that include all of the youth who are recovered from trafficking, right? Include all of the youth who are at risk for trafficking when we're talking about prevention, who, provide investigative tools and strategies that accommodate all of the youth who find themselves involved in trafficking. That's why we need to know how many, and that's why we need to be able to identify them effectively, and not just clump everyone under one topic that may or may not actually apply, or may be only a part of the problem. So in Chicago, there are no numbers. There continue to be no numbers. We're trying right now. We're in the middle of developing hopefully a working group for Chicago in Chicago for people interested, agencies and individuals interested on working on this issue with us. But we don't have those numbers at this point, and we need to know. We need to know, because we do want to identify the size of the problem, and we want to be able to develop more appropriate ways of accommodating all of the youth who are at risk of or who are involved in trafficking. All right, so I speak at conferences occasionally on this issue, and so I've taken to now just quizzing everybody as I go along about what's your experience with regard to disability and trafficking. So I was at a conference in Tennessee, and I was talking to a group of victim service providers who were specific to youth recovered from trafficking, and I asked them the same question. And there were two women in particular I was talking to, and one of them was quick to say that what she did see was that there was she could identify in her mind, because there were no numbers specifically, that a good number of the youth she sees who appear to have a developmental disability were involved in familial sex trafficking. That seemed to be an area where youth were more often taken advantage of, at least in the population of youth who she served. And that she felt like in some of the safe houses that she had developed, up to 75% of the youth had a developmental disability of some kind. Again, that's just observational on her part, because they don't have screeners, they don't have better ways of identifying you. The other woman who was standing with us, who also was a victim services provider and actually a friend of Miss Ivy's in Tennessee, was shocked at those numbers and said, in her experience, she didn't feel like any of the youth she served had a DD. That wasn't part of their experience at all. And the first woman said to her, like, that's not possible. I think you're just not recognizing it when you see it. You're chalking up the challenges that those kids are having to some other issue. And that brought me back to this idea of mental illness. I wonder if that is where we're counting people. But what we can see from this is that here's why we need to know, is because we have some people who are telling us that up to 75% of the youth that they serve have a developmental disability of some kind. We have other people who aren't recognizing it at all. We have law enforcement who isn't keeping track of it and who isn't even recognizing it. Fortunately, we have some who are wondering about it, thinking like, yeah, this is an important topic. What I haven't done yet, and what I think we all need to do, and what is one of the purposes of webinars like this, is in the disability community, we also need to be thinking about this. We have started to sort of recognize the importance of thinking about trauma and thinking about abuse and neglect with regard to individuals with disability, as well as those outside of, as well as those who don't have disabilities. But what we need to fold into that is the possibility that some of the youth who we're working with are being trafficked. And we need to find better ways from a prevention angle of identifying youth at risk. We need to find better ways from an intervention angle of providing services for youth with disabilities who have been trafficked. And then we also need to support and provide training and develop awareness in the law enforcement community around the fact that we have a good number of youth or who are experiencing trafficking or who are at risk of trafficking. And that needs to be recognized, because what we want to be able to do is do a better job at those investigations, which means accommodating for on issues specifically related to disability, whether they're communication issues, whether they're access issues, and whether they're just issues related to myths and misperceptions as a society that we might hold with regard to trafficking or regard to people with disabilities generally. So I'd like to talk and think a lot about theory of mind for a couple of reasons. When we talk about the intersection of trafficking and disability, we tend to think about, and what we're going to talk a good bit about today, are issues related to risk factors and vulnerabilities. And what I worry about is that webinars like this, trainings like this, tend to sort of push forward in our mind the vision of the disability community as victims, the disability community as experiencing vulnerability in a way that's wholly separate from the rest of society, right? When in fact, vulnerability is a human issue, right? We all have vulnerabilities of one kind or another, but we just need to be able to contemplate all of the options that any individual human might experience that makes them perhaps more vulnerable to one kind of exploitation or another, one area of victimization or another. But what we don't want to do is sort of, because of the topic we're talking about, because we're maybe focusing for the purpose of this training on issues related to vulnerability and risk factors, we don't want to create in our minds a picture of the disability community as victims. All right, so theory of mind. Why do I bring that up with regard to theory of mind? Because theory of mind, I think, is a primary vulnerability when it comes to issues of abuse generally, but trafficking in particular. Theory of mind is, and because we have kind of we could do like a full day training on any of these topics. Theory of mind is one of my favorite things to contemplate, because it's such an interesting element of the human brain and the human thought process that I think is under considered when we think about communication challenges that any of us might have, but that we know falls out more frequently and sometimes more severely for people, particularly with autism, but also with other areas of developmental disability. Theory of mind is that ability we all have in a split second when we come into a relationship with another human to develop a theory of what's going on in their mind. And what do we base that theory on? We base it on, what do we know about that person? What do we know about people like that person? What context are we in? What's my intention in this encounter? What's my guess about their intention in this encounter? And based on my theory of what's going on in that person's mind, I'm going to modify what I say and what I do based on my theory of how they're going to respond, and is it going to further my motivation in this encounter, and is it going to satisfy their motivation, their intention in this encounter. When that falls out for us, when we are not good at theory of mind, we have trouble gauging the other person's motivation, intention, truthfulness, because our brain kind of has just a basic foundational thought that our two minds match. I and they share the same knowledge, and not only that, but we feel the same way about it. And when theory of mind isn't effective for an individual, that person is more vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. One thing, we know in terms of areas of deficit for people with autism or people with other developmental disabilities can be the issue of theory of mind. Importantly, theory of mind and deficits in that area are not unique to autism. They're not unique to developmental disability. All of us have disability to one extent or another. And and what we find in the typical population are people who have poor theory of mind. And that creates vulnerability in that individual as well. And so while this is something that is more common in the experience of some people with autism or other developmental disabilities, it's not unique to that population. Again, we want to be able to accommodate all the members of our society, right? In terms of how we develop our systems. So when we are developing our systems of prevention, intervention, investigation, we need to be aware that this is a particular area of concern for people with autism or other developmental disabilities, but it's not unique, right? This is, I bring this up because I think it's so important that we not hold in our minds a picture of one part of our community as you know, that's the community of victims. They're not, right? But we do have to be aware of enhanced vulnerabilities or enhanced risk factors. So let's continue and think about what those might be. All right, did I get that right? I think I'm skipping a slide. All right, so one thing to think about, I think I'm skipping a slide here, but that's okay, it is what is the most common way that perpetrators online gain access to children on the internet? It's online gaming. These giant, you know, online games, particularly those that offer opportunities for conversation among players who are strangers outside of any kind of monitored setting. So statistics show that youth with autism, for example, spend the majority of their time on screen-based technology. And what I've seen in my practice as a trauma therapist and in my work with youth with autism is that their ability to be manipulated, their ability to be sort of sucked into relationships online that they would never have when offline, it's really enhanced. And why is that? Because their theory of mind can be pretty poor. And so it doesn't occur to them that I'm a 13-year-old, I love hockey, I love video gaming, I'm on Discord. If you have youth or kids who are on Discord, which is an app related to, that provides these opportunities for conversation with strangers around topics of joint interest like gaming, Discord is full of perpetrators. So be aware. If you're a 13-year-old and you think you're talking to another 13-year-old, somebody presents themselves as a 13-year-old and says, oh, you know, I like this game too. What else do you like? I like hockey. Oh, I like hockey too. Oh, what else? You know, and they're finding commonalities between the two of them. In my experience, it can be really difficult to get the person I'm working with, a youth with autism, to understand that the person on the other end of their computer might be lying, that might not be an actual 13-year-old, that is in fact a stranger, that they don't know them. I have had this conversation with many people, and I recently had an experience with a client who had come, I'd seen for a couple of years for a variety of reasons, but while he was seeing me, got onto Discord in the context of a game and ended up in what was clearly a grooming situation with somebody on the other end. And it was nearly impossible for me to convince the person I was working with that the person on the other end wasn't his new best friend. And it was kind of heartbreaking as well, because that person was really good at grooming. And so we just need to be aware that these opportunities exist where we don't necessarily expect them. This particular client's mom, she was just heartbroken that this had happened. Unfortunately, with this client of mine, it sort of did extend to where he was at significant risk and had probably been exploited. That's still sort of out there, but she was heartbroken about that she had allowed him to end up in that position. But because he's so socially isolated outside of his life on the computer, she was so happy that he had friends. And so she let her guard down as well. She also wasn't aware of the risk. So these are risks that we need to be aware of, because they exist, and they exist at a disproportionate rate for some of our youth who have autism or other developmental disabilities. These are some of the apps that cause all kinds of problems. This one that's called Whisper, I think it says something like, tell me the secrets you wouldn't tell anybody else. Well, who wants to know those secrets? Who people who want to exploit you. But youth fall into this pretty easily, and youth with whose theory of mind, whose ability to sort of judge the motivation or intention of other people might be diminished, are more likely. Youth who feel socially isolated might be more vulnerable under these circumstances and in these contexts. So some of the other things that create vulnerability are myths and misperceptions, sort of societal issues, right? People with disabilities are asexual, or maybe they're hypersexual. But whatever the case, we don't need to teach lessons around healthy sexuality and healthy relationships. That leaves people at risk. People with disability don't get sexually assaulted. I have actually had people say things to me like, "Oh, nobody would do that to this person," or "Why would somebody want to have sex with that person?" Right? And well, first of all, sexual assault isn't about sex; it's about power and control. But second of all, humans are humans, and you can see the sort of distorted perception of difference that displays. People with disabilities don't benefit from therapy. We have a huge problem with access to appropriate mental health services for people with developmental disabilities. Often they're excluded from services from community mental health centers or other sources of mental health support because the providers don't feel like they know enough about disability or autism to provide appropriate services. And they feel like, well, if they have a communication problem, they wouldn't be able to benefit from the kind of therapy that I do, without thinking that, I have to be flexible with all my clients. I could be flexible with this client as well. We also, as a society, have taken a very behavioral approach to therapy, where we often mistake symptoms of trauma and other issues for behavioral problems, and we address them as behavioral problems without looking at the underlying reason for the behavior, not the function, attention seeking, avoidant, but the actual reason for it. The reason, well, why do they need attention? Why do they need attention now? And why is this the best way they could think of to get it? We need to sort of shift our thinking on that. People with disabilities don't experience trauma like typical people. I've had many people brought to the clinic for clear symptoms of trauma that providers simply view as behavioral issues that need to be stopped. This person cries too much. Why do they cry? I don't know, but it's bothering everyone. It needs to stop. Well, I'm gonna try to look for why are they crying. I've had people brought in because they have sexual behavior issues. I've had people brought in because they have molested housemates, and the provider wants me to work with that person on their sexual behavior issues. And I say, oh my gosh, who's helping the housemate? Oh, no, he's fine. This person didn't mean it, right? I have had two situations in cases I was consulting with law enforcement on involving trafficking, where the cases were closed, at least initially, because the law enforcement felt like the individual didn't seem to mind. Was in two cases what people said, they didn't seem to mind. And there was no consideration for whether or not that person who was being exploited even had the capacity, the judgment to recognize that they're being exploited, or had the feeling, the sense that they had a right to say no, or that they had even knew where to ask for help, and or recognize that this didn't have to be their life, that there were other possibilities out there for them. But because they didn't openly object, they didn't openly display distress, the cases were at least initially closed. Compounding vulnerabilities. CSEC is commercial sexual exploitation of children. Social powerlessness, right? When we don't raise people up in terms of helping them recognize in themselves the right to say no, the right to advocate for themselves, the right to live a life of dignity and respect. Diminished ability to protect themselves, right? Lack of instruction or resources. If you want people to advocate for themselves, they need to have instruction on how to do that. Who can they ask for help? Where can they go for help? I have adults who come to me who do not know their own phone number and address. If they were in a situation of exploitation, they wouldn't know who to call, and they wouldn't be able to call for help. We need to be training on that. Inability to detect who is safe to be around. That theory of mind falls out. But we also have situations where we have people who have experienced a life where their own agency in their lives was not valued, supported, or taught, really, right? So people, if other people are always making decisions for you, if you are on a behavior plan that really doesn't teach you to advocate for yourself, in other words, teaches you that you shouldn't say no, that could be considered oppositional or defiant, you're more apt to be compliant, right? You're more apt not to recognize that somebody is behaving in a way or acting towards you in a way that's not acceptable and that you don't deserve. Once somebody's been trafficked, they're sometimes less able to conceive of escape options. If it didn't work the first time, or then I don't have another way of thinking. I'm not a flexible problem solver, so I can't think of another way. Or if I sort of manage to get out of a situation once, I might not have other ideas that I to come up with, right? I might not be flexible in a different situation on figuring out how to get myself out of this situation or who to ask for help. Again, they don't have the right to say no. Children and youth with intellectual or developmental disability are often seen as less credible to law enforcement. And this is an experience that I've had time and again in my work with law enforcement, with child protective services, and even with adult protective services. Is just a lack of confidence by law enforcement or other protective services that this individual is able to give a statement or give testimony that's reliable. In fact, people know what happened to their body, and they often know who did it. And we have to be more flexible in how we communicate. We have to be more flexible in how we communicate with that person. We have to think of how are we going to accommodate all of the members of society, not just some of the members of society. And there, in fact, now there's a new forensic interviewing protocol that's been developed specifically to provide accommodation for different communication styles, and even for people who don't speak. And so if we have investigators out there, that's something that's available now. It's called the FIND protocol. All right, let's see. Compounding vulnerabilities. One thing we know, a big vulnerability to trafficking is sexual abuse, previous sexual abuse. And we know that children with disabilities are 3 to 4 times at greater risk of sexual abuse than children who don't have vulnerabilities. We know that youth with gender dysphoria are at greater risk of sexual exploitation. We know that there is a higher rate of co-occurrence of gender dysphoria and autism than in the typical population. And so again, we've got a group that's at risk, and that group is overrepresented or has increased representation in the community of people who also have autism. Disability, and especially communications disorders and intellectual disability, are overrepresented in the runaway population. What's one of the biggest risk factors for sexual exploitation and trafficking for youth? Being a runaway. And now we recognize that youth with disability are overrepresented in that community. Coming out of the foster system, another group that is at higher risk of trafficking. Children with IDD are overrepresented in the community of children in foster care. So we can see in each of these areas, we have youth with disability who are disproportionately represented, right? 31% of the foster care population has a disability. And we know that that is a group that is at significantly greater risk of sexual exploitation and trafficking. Some of the endangering activities that put youth at risk of trafficking: running away or elopement, something that we see not uncommonly among youth with disability or autism. As we discussed, among youth who have run away, there's an overrepresentation of youth with disability. Unsupervised use of the internet, sexting, I think easily manipulated into providing sexually explicit texts and pictures and videos. Poor comprehension of dangerous situations. Again, that kind of speaks to issues around theory of mind, also issues about sort of being able to read your environment, inability to distinguish traffickers from a friend, right? We know that one of the ways that children are exploited is that the trafficker convinces that person that you're my girlfriend, I'm your boyfriend, I'll take care of you. If you love me, you'll do this. If you love me, you'll support this family that I've pulled together for us by having sex with this number of people per night and bringing home this much money. That's what you owe this family. High risk behaviors due to previous sexual abuse, exploitation. When youth with disabilities are trafficked, the exploitation tends to be longer. And that's because that a lot of reasons, but one of them being more easily manipulated because of poor theory of mind and all of the other communication issues and thinking issues that we've talked about. Some of the red flags, right? What we want to think about as providers, right? We always want to be aware that trafficking is a possibility, right? Exploitation is a possibility. I have a sister who works in the public schools in Columbus. They had specific training on how to identify youth at risk in their classrooms and some of the red flags that they should be watching for with regard to youth in the classroom who might be experiencing trafficking. This is something as disability providers that we need to be thinking about as well. Our youth are not, immune from this, and in fact, as we've seen, they have enhanced vulnerability. So when we think about that, how are we going to sort of start to recognize red flags? How are we going to keep these in mind? Well, we always want to be aware of change. So what do you already know about a youth? And has something changed? Is there a change in that person's behavior, their physical condition, or their situation? Let's be aware of that. Let's start thinking about that and include among the reasons why we might see some of these changes, trafficking or exploitation as a possibility, right? So behaviorally, has their communication changed? Are they more reluctant to engage? Are they talking about things that are not appropriate to their age or maturity level? These are changes we want to be aware of and we want to think about. Are they displaying now new fears? Do they look tired all the time? Do they have depression that they're not willing to talk about, or that we can't figure out reasons for? Is there a sudden inability to perform tasks? Are they no longer able to sort of stay on task to the extent that they used to be able to? And the reason we think about this is issues related to trauma, when people are distracted by hypervigilance. We want to look at situational changes. Are they talking about a boyfriend or a girlfriend who is significantly older? Are they talking about people in a way that we start to worry about somebody controlling them, right? Is it a friend, a boss, a partner, a family member who seems to be controlling their life in a way that it makes us uncomfortable or worried, and seems to make that person less able to access people outside of their family or support system? Are they talking about being, I can't do that because I have to worry about something bad could happen? This was exactly the situation with the young man I was working with, who ended up being exploited online. Someone is threatening the youth or somebody close to them. They're worrying now about their own safety or the safety of people around them. They have new possessions or items of value, right? Somebody starts, suddenly they're showing up in clothes or jewelry that you think, wow, they didn't dress like that, or they didn't have that before. They don't, where are they getting the financial means to acquire these things? We need to think about that. If they start telling you their boyfriend is buying them these things, here's one thing we need to think about. Could there be exploitation or trafficking involved in that? And then watching if people are becoming disconnected from their social support. Physically, we want to be watching for injuries that are not explained, injuries that are not being treated, injuries related to exposure, right? If kids are out on the street looking for tricks, that there can be exposure issues involved, and extreme exhaustion, right? Sometimes again, trafficking is going to be on our list of possibilities. We're not saying that these are, if you see this, that person's being trafficked. We're saying that trafficking needs to be in your file folder of possibilities when you start seeing physical concerns like this, or situational concerns like we talked about. In terms of investigation, we want to make sure that we have law enforcement that is able to slow down their investigation, right? That if they recognize that somebody has a disability, that they are taking the time to educate themselves on the disability so that they can better engage that youth. Youth who have been trafficked are notoriously difficult to engage in terms of investigation and prosecution. We need to slow down and think of all the ways that we might be better able to accommodate them, communication-wise, sensory-wise, their ability to understand what's going on, or how we're trying to help them, or that we're trying to help them. We need to encourage law enforcement and other investigators to talk to school family therapists about better ways of engaging this particular youth, so that we can further investigations instead of cut them off because we think the kid is too difficult, or because we can't imagine that communication is going to be possible, or because we have in our head this idea that they can't be reliable anyway. In terms of intervention, we want, from a mental health perspective, we want to make sure that we are providing trauma services for all of the children, including children with disabilities. And that means opening up our practices, whether they're community mental health or private practices, for all of the children, accommodating and taking care of all of the children in our society, not just some of them, breaking down the silos between mental health and disability. In terms of victim services, we want to make sure that we're providing services and facilities that are adapted and accommodating to all of the people who need our services, including people with disabilities. Prevention. We want to make sure that we are creating a society that values all of its children, so that children feel loved and accepted, right? We want to provide healthy sexuality and healthy relationship education for all of our children. We want to improve access to disability resources and supports, particularly in areas, we have plenty of areas that are under-resourced or underserved, and we want to make sure that we're extending our support across the community. We want to make sure that the child welfare system is better able to support children with disability. I have found that they are reaching out more now than they did in the past, but that continues to be a problem. Better training for law enforcement, specific training for youth on the dangers that face runaways, the dangers, how to identify dangers, and dangerous situations. And then we want to make sure that we're tailoring safety plans to accommodate all of our youth, right? Recognizing how to create support systems that can support youth despite or in addition to whatever supports they need for their disability. Partnering with local resources, extremely important. This is how we break down silos. In the Chicago area, I think you'll all have access to this PowerPoint. These are all really fabulous resources where you can educate yourself better and more with regard to trafficking and the intersection of trafficking and disability. There are legal service providers out there who can support people, youth who have been trafficked. We've got other anti-trafficking resources. So we have like 5 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions from anybody. But what I'm going to encourage sort of in summary here is that we recognize that youth with disabilities are at enhanced risk of exploitation. And at the same time, I want us to be hyper aware that we are not, as a result of that, sort of re-envisioning the disability population as a population of people who are victims. We want to support all of our members, not just some of them. I think that's what it comes down to. All right. Are there any questions? I don't see any. Jody, any thoughts, any questions you have?
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is Jody. I think that was very well presented, and I really appreciate the perspective. And I think it really brings home some very real life examples of what trafficking can look like, either labor trafficking or sex trafficking within the communities that we're working with. So I don't have any further questions for you, but I do want to let everybody know that the next webinars will be talking more about trauma-informed care and actually working with young people who may be experiencing trafficking or other forms of exploitation and trauma. So giving you the skills and ability to have that trauma-informed care to be able to work with young people. Thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
I see several people are asking about access to the PowerPoint. Are they going to, I think on the IDHD website, there will be a link to it. Jody, is that correct?
Yeah, this is Rhonda. So we will email the PowerPoint slides to all those who registered.
Excellent. And please do feel free to contact me if you have any thoughts, questions, ideas. If you're interested in sort of furthering your knowledge or your work in this area specifically, the National Disability and Human Trafficking Working Group is working very hard to create trainings and linking services and providing more opportunities for providers from both the disability and the trafficking side to enhance services and understanding of the intersection of disability and trafficking. It looks like that's it. Anybody else? Last chance.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Susan, Jessica, and Jody. Susan, is there a slide with your email for people to, if they want to contact you with further questions?
Let's see. Yep, there it is right there.
Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, again, I want to thank all of you. Thanks everyone for attending the webinar. Feel free to contact Susan if you have any further questions. And don't forget to register for the last webinar of this series, which is gonna be next Wednesday, November 17th. Yeah, so thank you all for this great webinar.
Thanks for attending.
Thank you.